Danger Dolan. From wars in the Middle East to faulty computer chips simulating a real nuclear attack, we count 15 times the world almost came to an end in our age of nuclear weapons.
Number 15.
The 1979 NORAD computer glitch. This occurred on the morning of November 9th, 1979 at Colorado's North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD. Technicians received reports that the Soviets had launched a series of missiles at North America, with the response being to launch 10 interceptor fighter planes, get the president onto an escape plane, and prepare to launch a retaliatory strike. Then we find out a technician had accidentally started a training program to simulate a Soviet attack, a computer glitch that almost destroyed everyone on Earth.
Number 14.
The attack on Yonpyong. This took place not too long ago, November 2010, an attack by North Korea against South Korean troops stationed on the island of Yonpyong. They launched a total of 160 missiles against them, decimating a huge number of people, and even worse, inciting the possibility this border conflict might escalate into World War III. Though we have avoided it so far, this event is still a tragic, meaningless waste of human life.
Number 13.
The B-52 crash near Thule, January 21st, 1968. A fire breaks out on a B-52 bomber. The pilot has no time to contact base before he bails out. The plane crashes in some ice 7 miles offshore of Thule. Then its fuel and certain compounds of nuclear weapons explode, but does not trigger a nuclear detonation. If it had, alerts would have shown an attack on both the nearby base and the bomber itself, indicating to the White House an enemy attack and need for immediate retaliation, but luckily none of this came to pass.
Number 12.
The 1995 research rocket, Norway, January of 1995. Local scientists launch a research rocket to study the aurora borealis. Meanwhile, in Russia, eyes boggle as what looks like a gigantic nuclear warhead torpedoes towards them. So President Boris Yeltsin whips out his briefcase full of nuclear codes purely to launch nukes at every target they can reach. Thankfully, the missile fell into the ocean. Yeltsin put away his briefcase and instead picked up a delicious sandwich.
Number 11.
The Soviet Early Warning Era, September 26, 1983. A secret bunker owned by the Soviets. Commander Stanislav Petrov has just settled into his chair when a loud siren goes off and the screens show that Americans have launched 5 missiles. They only have minutes to respond. There was chaos and stress in the bunker. Because of the enormous incoming payload, the chain of command went straight to Petrov and he had to decide if he wanted to respond with missiles or call in a false alarm. He decided to do the latter, but not because he realized they were fakes, no, because he knew his equipment was new and he was not prepared to begin World War III based on computer data alone. But he said he really did believe missiles were on their way, which made it damn near impossible to call them fakes, but he did, and we are all thankful for his call in judgment.
Number 10.
Able Archer 83. This is another training program like the NORAD computer glitch, but much more elaborate and very nearly took us to war by accident. It was an exercise called Able Archer 83, in which an attack on Europe would be met with a US military strike on the Soviets. The US airlifted 19,000 troops to Europe and changed alert status to DEFCON 1. And meanwhile, although the Soviets knew it was just a war game, they'd been warned, they too went into high alert and prepared their nukes, both poised to attack at the drop of a feather. But luckily the games ended not long after and things calmed down.
Number 9.
9/11, one of the most tragic events in modern history. The Twin Towers, those iconic structures from New York City, were hit by 2 aeroplanes on September 11th, 2001. Likewise, another plane crashed into the Pentagon and one more near the White House on the same day, perpetrated by Osama bin Laden and the terrorist group Al-Qaeda. Over 3,000 people died that day, and it began the war on terror, which could have quickly escalated into a bomb-filled conflict. Nuclear terrorism is the next step up from this, but thankfully countries around the world are taking measures to prevent this.
Number 8.
The Middle East false alarm, 1973. The US sponsored a ceasefire to end the Arab-Israeli war, but further fighting began between Egyptian and Israeli troops in the Sinai Desert. Since Nixon was involved in the Watergate scandal, several US officials took it upon themselves to enter DEFCON 3 to warn the USSR not to intervene with the events in Sinai. This was all fine, except a klaxon accidentally went off in the Kinchol Air Force Base in Michigan, which you do not want during DEFCON 3. This set off the entire base and almost had B-52 bombers take off, but luckily the alarm was fixed and nothing else happened.
Number 7.
The war in Afghanistan. Here we find a 9-year conflict, an attack by two world powers against each other without using nukes. Instead, by having the US and UK finance and arm Afghan mujahideen to fight the local Soviets. A proxy war, you might say, hiding behind foreign troops to further your own agendas. It was such a sickening move that Jimmy Carter was quoted as saying that it was the most significant threat to world peace since World War II. Two enemies involving an overseas body shield between their own personal conflicts with the result, escalation and possible destruction.
Number 6.
A faulty computer chip. June 3rd, 1980. A simple number algorithm showing whether nukes were on their way and how many. Where it should have read 0000, it read 2222. And although the number was insanely high, it was still feasible, and nuclear bomber crews started their engines waiting for the go-ahead. It was discovered to be a false alarm though, and things were fine. But once again, 3 days later, the same thing happened. 2,222 bombs on their way. The nuclear bomber crew still had their engines revved from earlier that week. But the problem was basic. A computer chip displayed zeros as twos. But even so, all it takes is one bad computer chip to wipe out the entire human race.
Number 5.
The Cuban Missile Crisis. The rest of the items in this list will relate to this crisis spanning 13 terrifying days in 1962. Missile silos were stationed in Cuba, and boats shipped even more nukes to their country. But US President Kennedy formed a blockade to stop these boats from arriving. The Soviets took this as an act of aggression, and I quote, one that propels humankind into the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. 13 days passed in which US Navy boats were told to open fire on any encroaching ships. And then Kennedy made a deal with Soviet Premier Khrushchev to dismantle their warheads in Turkey, as well as agree to never invade Cuba, and in exchange the Soviets would remove all their weapons from Cuba. It is the closest humankind has ever come to engaging in an all-out nuclear war.
Number 4.
An animal nearly starts World War III. During the same period in the missile crisis, alarms went up in a Duluth American airbase, indicating an intruder and possibly Soviet bombers overhead. Pilots scrambled around, already tense from the most chaotic time in history, but it was a false alarm, one that nearly destroyed us all, and it was caused by a bear. That's right, a damn bear somehow snuck into the base and set off alarms, almost killing every man, woman and child on this planet.
Number 3.
The Moorestown false alarm. October 28th, a town in New Jersey reported that a nuclear attack was underway, when in reality it was a test tape simulating a Cuban missile attack. But coincidentally, a satellite happened to pass over the area at the exact moment which, when combined with the stress from those 13 days, leads to a recipe for assumptions. The entirety of NORAD was informed and put on alert, but before a counterattack could take place, the expected time of the Moorestown explosion did not happen. The radar system responsible for confirming an incoming missile was not in operation that day because personnel had been reassigned for the crisis.
Number 2.
The U-2 spy plane. 1 day before the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, an American spy plane got lost because the Aurora Borealis obscured his vision of the stars used for navigation. He drifted off course and ended up in the airspace of the Soviet Union. This simple miscalculation caused a dramatic response from both sides. The Soviets scrambled fighter jets to intercept and destroy the plane, while the Americans sent nuclear-armed fighters in response to escort the plane back to American soil, which they did just barely before the Soviet jets arrived. Had either side engaged in aerial warfare, it would have been a disaster.
Number 1.
The B-59 submarine. The same day as the spy plane begins my favorite story from that era, one that shows how one man can save or destroy the entire planet. This Soviet B-59 submarine was holding underwater near the US blockade line near Cuba when an American ship began dropping warning shots to force them to resurface. The submarine officers took this as real legitimate fire to mark the beginning of World War III, and the captain ordered a nuclear missile for launch. Had he alone been given authority to launch, a nuclear war would have begun that day. But luckily he needed 2 senior officers to give the okay, and one of them didn't. Vasily Arkhipov, who convinced them to resurface and request new orders from Moscow. This man, Vasily Arkhipov, saved the world, and it would be another 40 years before people found out about it. That's it for this countdown. Have a good one!